Voters of Utah. And tonight we're pleased to have Carey Dabney, long-term league member and expert in federal public lands, to talk with us about the federal public lands issues. Carey's going to present a PowerPoint, a short film, and then a further lecture, and then there'll be time for questions and answers. During the presentation, I'm going to ask everyone to keep their mics muted so we don't hear, your cats growling in the background or dogs barking or anything else. And then if you have questions, to write them into the chat. I'll be trying to make sure all the questions get surfaced during Q&A. After the Q&A time, there's going to be some brief announcements about upcoming league events. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Carey, who will be talking, and Peggy, who will be handling the PowerPoint and the film.
Okay, am I on now? Great. Peggy, if you want to start the PowerPoint. Pull that first thing on the screen. Okay, so this was labeled protecting Utah's public lands. And right in the beginning here, I didn't pick up on the fact that this isn't about Utah's public lands. It's actually about protecting America's public lands in Utah. And so the campaign to get people to think that these are Utah's public lands has been ongoing for a very long time. And we all kind of fall into calling these all the lands in Utah's public lands. And so that's part of what our discussion will be tonight. So the next slide, please. All right. Just hello to everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you about America's public lands in Utah and how we can work together to protect them. As Linda said, I'm Carey Dabney, and I am co-founder of America's Public Land, a group of engaged citizens committed to raising national awareness about the serious and growing threats to our shared public lands. Unfortunately, there's been a great deal of disinformation and misinformation circulating on this issue, creating a false narrative over several decades that has not been successfully countered. That's why America's Public Land compiled a set of reliable, accessible resources on our website to help cut through the noise and spread the truth. These include, next slide, please. The 2020 League of Women Voters of Utah Educational Study and Recording on the Transfer of Public Lands Movement, which explores how the U.S. public lands came to be and what they provide both economically and culturally, and the consequences to the future of these lands and public access to them if the transfer of public lands movement succeeds. Next slide. On that website, we also have the film, The History and Future of America's Public Land by Walt Dabney, who's been traveling around the country since 2018, teaching about how the U.S. acquired its public land, the movement to transfer them to state control, and why this could lead to their sale to private owners, permanently eliminating public access. The film has been described as everything you will ever need to know to win any argument about the future of our American public lands. So it's an excellent resource. Next slide, please. And then the America's Public Land Educational Toolkit, which outlines what you need to watch for, has links to information you can use to educate yourself and others about the issues, includes articles to help you understand the backstory behind the transfer movement, and also how to reach out to your elected representatives to advocate for retention of America's public lands in public hands. Next slide. My goal with this webinar is to empower you to speak up, to share accurate information, and to inspire others to join the effort to protect the lands that belong to all of us, and to change the narrative that has been going on now for decades, in which so many people believe. So let's close the slides, and I'll start the discussion. All right. For decades, Utah has led a coordinated and well-funded disinformation campaign aimed at pressuring Congress to transfer federally owned public lands held in trust for all Americans to state control, where they could then be sold. Utah's effort is intended to serve as a model for other states to follow. Many current elected officials at the local, state, and national levels were raised on the false narrative that the federal government has no constitutional authority to own land, that Utah was treated unfairly at statehood, that these lands originally belonged to Utah, and other misleading claims. The politicians, funders, and supporters behind this false narrative still believe they are winning in the court of public opinion. However, in 2020, the League of Women Voters adopted a national position based on a 2017 study by the League of Women Voters of New Mexico. This study was prompted by state-level legislation, including a 2012 Utah law demanding the transfer of 31 million acres of certain federal lands within the state. The League of Women Voters' national position is that federal lands should remain under federal jurisdiction and benefit all Americans, that multiple use sustained yield policy should guide management by the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, that the League supports improvements in management and regulation, and that any proposed transfer must be preceded by a full assessment, including environmental, health, and economic impacts, cultural and tribal considerations, public access, and disaster management. Because this is a national position, not only can local and state leagues advocate for America's public lands, but the League of Women Voters of the United States is empowered to advocate for congressional and administrative protections of our shared public lands. So with all of this in mind, let's watch the following presentation, Exposing the Transfer Movement. Afterwards, we'll discuss possible next steps we can take to protect our public lands. Peggy, thank you. Can you start it, Peggy?
Resources to help you take action by starting conversations with others, sharing on social media, speaking to community groups, writing to local media, and most importantly, contacting your members of Congress. Walt Dabney, founder of America's Public Land, believes every American deserves to know the truth about the threats to their public lands from unscrupulous politicians, developers, and corporations. Walt is a retired park professional with a 43-year career spanning both the National Park Service, NPS, and Texas Parks and Wildlife. A graduate of Texas A&M, he began his career as a ranger naturalist in Yellowstone and went on to serve in key leadership roles across iconic parks, including Yosemite, Grand Teton, Everglades, and as chief ranger of the NPS in Washington, D.C. He later led the Southeast Utah group of parks and served as director of Texas State Parks. Known for his expertise in law enforcement, search and rescue, fire management, and public land policy, Dabney now teaches at leadership institutes and universities and frequently speaks on the history of America's public lands. My passion for public lands began with childhood road trips out west, leading me to study anthropology and geology at the University of Illinois and work as a seasonal ranger in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. In 2020, I led the League of Women Voters of Utah's study on the transfer of public lands movement, examining the history of public lands, the land transfer movement, and the legal, economic, and social impacts of those efforts. I now volunteer with America's Public Land, curating research on the politics of land sell-offs and highlighting the vital role public lands play in all aspects of American life. So what are the lands we need to protect from privatization? America's public lands include national parks, forests, monuments, trails, conservation areas, historic sites, rivers, wildlife refuges, and Bureau of Land Management lands. While most are located in the West, these lands belong to all Americans, not just the states where they are found. Many people are familiar with national parks, but the majority of public lands are not parks. They support a range of uses, including recreation, grazing, mining, and conservation. The federal government manages roughly 640 million acres, about 28% of all U.S. land. 4 main agencies oversee 95% of it. They are the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service. Throughout America's history, the U.S. government's role has included policies for acquiring, disposing of, and retaining public land. So where did these lands come from? Before European settlement, the land that is now the United States was home to indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for thousands of years. As European settlers arrived, they claimed land through conquest and displacement of native nations. After the Revolutionary War, the original 13 colonies ceded land west of the Appalachian Mountains to the federal government. West of the Mississippi River, most land was acquired by the federal government through treaties and purchases from foreign powers. These lands were obtained under the federal government's treaty-making authority and are managed under the Property Clause of the U.S. Constitution. These lands are important economic drivers for national, state, and rural gateway economies. Operating under different mandates, some of these lands are used to provide timber, minerals, hydrocarbons, and rangelands. Others preserve historical and archaeological sites that highlight our shared history as Americans, play a critical role in mitigating climate change, provide our country with clean air and water, provide habitat for wildlife, and are places where every American and visitor from around the world, regardless of socioeconomic status, can enjoy the excitement of outdoor recreation and the solace of nature, creating lifetime memories for themselves and their families. So what are the threats to America's public lands? America's founding fathers and mothers believed that an informed citizenry, supported by free speech, a free press, and public education, was essential for democracy, enabling debates based on shared facts. Although public discourse has long been marred by conspiracy theories and hate speech, the spread of mis and disinformation poses a critical threat to informed decision-making and to our democratic processes and institutions. Misinformation is false or misleading information, regardless of whether it's intentionally created and unwittingly shared. Disinformation is false information that is deliberately created and distributed with an intent to deceive or harm others. For decades, Utah lawmakers have led a well-funded campaign to transfer federally owned public lands into state control, creating a model for other states to follow. In 2005, Senate Bill 239 created the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, PLPCO, to promote and implement Utah's public land priorities. PLPCO studies land transfer issues and supports the Constitutional Defense Council, which advises the governor and others on public land policy. In 2012, despite warnings from the Utah Office of Legislative Research about its likely unconstitutionality, lawmakers passed HB 148, the Transfer of Public Lands Act, fueling a disinformation campaign around public land ownership. In 2015, Utah's congressional delegation formed a team to explore legal strategies to return public lands to their so-called rightful owners. Also, in 2015, Utah state lawmakers used taxpayer funds to hire a legal consulting firm tasked with evaluating alternative legal theories that Utah may use in court to attempt to gain ownership or control of the public lands within its borders. Despite the questionable legality of these theories, Utah legislators continued pushing land transfer bills based on these theories. In 2017, Utah's congressional delegation introduced the Disposal of Excess Federal Lands Act. And in January 2025, the U.S. House passed a rules package making it easier to sell off public lands. Under the rules, lawmakers will no longer need to account for lost revenues from nationally managed public lands if they decide to give those lands away to states or other interests. The Congressional Budget Office, which provides lawmakers with data so they can make budget decisions, will effectively consider public lands to have no monetary value, making wholesale sell-off of lands much simpler. However, the lands in question are neither excess nor without monetary value. They are the lands from which all of our parks, monuments, forests, recreation, and wilderness areas have been derived under authority of the Property Clause or the Antiquities Act. They are the lands all Americans have access to for hiking, camping, hunting, fishing, jeeping, and so much more. They are the lands that fuel our outdoor recreation industry to the tune of $9.5 billion in Utah and $1.2 trillion nationally. They are the lands that in 2008 were officially recognized as the National System of Public Lands. And despite the fact that these lands have broad support among Utahns and Americans, Utah legislators continue spending taxpayer money on disinformation campaigns to seize them from the American public. In August 2024, Utah filed a taxpayer-funded lawsuit asking the U.S. Supreme Court to decide whether the federal government can hold unappropriated public lands within a state indefinitely. At the same time, the state launched a $2 million public relations campaign, Stand for Our Land, Let Utah Manage Utah Land, to spread misleading claims through ads, billboards, TV, and social media. The campaign targeted national media, policymakers, and public opinion. Utah politicians know these lands don't belong to the state. They know Let Utah Manage Utah Land is misleading. They know this campaign distorts the facts. Because on July 14th, 2025, during a court hearing, the state of Utah had to admit that its taxpayer-funded Stand for Our Land lawsuit and public relations campaign is misleading. In its legal filing, the state conceded that the public lands targeted in its lawsuit were never owned by Utah, that Native American tribes have lived in present-day Utah since time immemorial, and the U.S. acquired the land from Mexico in 1848. That upon joining the Union in 1896, Utah citizens forever disclaimed all right and title to unappropriated public lands. That this disclaimer was a condition of statehood included in both Utah's Constitution and the Utah Statehood Enabling Act. And most telling, that if successful, the state's lawsuit will not result in public lands automatically being given to Utah, but instead would start a disposal process which could result in the sale of millions of acres of public lands to the highest bidder. So when Utah's elected officials tell you Utah's preference is that public land remain public, should you believe them? Because another thing politicians engaged in the transfer of public lands into state ownership don't tell you is that according to a 2014 report commissioned by the state titled An Analysis of a Transfer of Federal Lands to the State of Utah, two primary concerns regarding the land transfer from the federal government to state government are the cost of managing the lands and whether the state could generate enough revenue to cover that cost. The report indicates that the following revenue and resources would be lost to the state if the land transferred out of federal ownership. Federal wages and spending, which are an infusion of outside money into Utah's economy. FILT payments paid to counties to offset loss of tax revenue on U.S. public lands. Costs for wildfires, which make up almost 35% of the estimated direct land management cost for U.S. public lands in Utah that currently are 90% paid by the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service. Loss of access to key firefighting resources, including trained personnel, a fleet of aircraft, fire dispatch capacity, and aviation support infrastructure. Deferred maintenance costs of approximately $100 million because of insufficient funding over several decades. And abandoned mine openings, 8,000 to 11,000 of them, that need to be inventoried, field validated, and remediated, with 5 to 10% of these openings having associated water quality issues. And that per that same report, in order to make up for the loss of federal dollars, mineral revenue produced on public lands, including mineral lease revenue, oil and gas royalties, and coal royalties, would have to be increased. Based on the 2014 economic analysis, the land transfer could be profitable for the state if oil and gas prices remain stable and high, and the state negotiates a change in royalty revenue share with the U.S. government from 50% to 100%. In addition, land-based revenue and receipts collected by the BLM and U.S. Forest Service, including recreation fees, right-of-way rents, grazing fees, and timber sales receipts, also are a potential source of revenue if the state takes over these lands, but they too would probably need to be increased. The following figures are operations and management budget and costs underwritten by the federal government for the lands being targeted by the 2012 Transfer of Public Land Act legislation, and do not include federal money expended on the National Park Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service lands in Utah, except for payment in lieu of taxes, PILT. In 2018, in excess of $400 million of federal funding was expended in the state of Utah in support of public lands. If the state acquires these lands, they will lose those federal funds and have to make up the difference with state funding, or will have to sell those lands into private hands. The truth no one talks about is the fact that state ownership of America's public land in Utah or any other state would slash the tax base for supporting these lands from 50 states to 1 state. By law, states have to maintain a balanced budget. If the state can't afford to keep them, they would have to sell them. These lands will become private property. And although the Supreme Court declined to hear Utah's case, the state can still refile in a lower federal court or pursue new lawsuits aimed at gaining control over federal land. Governor Cox, President Adams, Speaker Schultz, and Attorney General Brown released the following statement. While we were hopeful that our request would expedite the process, we are disappointed in the Supreme Court's decision not to take up this case. The court's order does not say anything about the merits of Utah's important constitutional arguments or prevent Utah from filing its suit in federal district court. Utah remains able and willing to challenge any BLM land management decisions that harm Utah. We're also heartened to know the incoming administration shares our commitments to the principle of multiple use for these federal lands and is committed to working with us to improve land management. We will continue to fight to keep public lands in public hands because it is our stewardship, heritage, and home. Looks like none of them are backing down, and neither should you. To help you advocate for your public lands, we created a toolkit that offers clear, accessible information and practical steps you can take to help protect these vital landscapes. It includes a 1-hour feature film, The History and Future of America's Public Land, reports exposing the disinformation behind the land transfer movement, guidance on what to watch for in the future, and how to contact your elected senators and representatives to Congress. Get informed, get engaged. Tell everyone you know what is happening. Share this information on social media, in letters to the editor, with community groups, and with your elected representatives at the local, state, and national level. They need to know the truth about America's public lands. Make keeping public lands in public ownership a campaign issue. The vast majority of Americans love their public lands. We can vote to keep them, or we can vote to lose them. Find out what those running for office plan to do, and then vote accordingly. Because the Constitution empowers Congress to turn public lands over to states or private interests, if it so wishes, defenders of public lands should not be complacent. Public lands will remain in U.S. ownership only if that policy continues to command the support of the American people.
So Peggy, put the screen back on, I guess, me.
Welcome to the
Sorry.
Public
That's
Land
okay.
presentation for America's public land.
Am I on now? I'm back on. Okay, great. So lots of information, but let me just follow it up with some more discussion points. We have a challenge. How do we educate the country? Utah legislators may be leading the charge to transfer federal public lands to state control, but the other 49 states can have a role in stopping that from happening. So how do we get the facts out? especially when Utah Senator John Curtis, in his inaugural speech to the Senate, said the following: "To my colleagues in the Senate from the East, it may be hard to grasp just how deeply federal overreach affects daily life in Utah. In some counties, more than 80%, 90% of the land is owned and controlled, not by local leaders or communities, but by a distant federal government. How do you create opportunity when 90% of your land doesn't generate property tax? How do you plan for the future when most of your land is off limits by federal decree?" What is left out of his plea to his colleagues in the East is the fact that outdoor recreation on Utah's public lands is a $9.5 billion industry. If those lands are transferred or sold, that industry and the jobs, communities, and culture it supports will collapse. I'd like to know how Senator Curtis and the Utah delegation to Congress plan on replacing that $9.5 billion. Do they really think coal and cows are the future of Utah? Do they not understand why we have an arch on our license plates and not an oil rig? Right now, the American public is being gaslighted and ignored by many of our elected officials. So how do we, the American public, get a seat at the table? Users of public lands, and this includes environmental groups, recreationists, small businesses, the outdoor recreation industry from makers of camping gear to RVs, off-road vehicle enthusiasts, ranchers who graze on federal lands, faith communities, and everyday citizens who vacation on these lands, all bring important voices and stories to the public lands narrative. But right now, we're fragmented and in many cases unaware of what is about to happen to our way of life if these lands become privatized. It is time to speak with one voice. What if, in addition to what everyone is already doing, and we're all part of, a Sierra Club or a Hunters and Anglers group or a biking group, so we know what effort is going on out there right now. But what if we collaborated on a single strategy to ask just one simple question over the next year prior to the midterms and the 2026 elections? What if we asked every elected official and every candidate from city council to Congress across the country, do you support keeping America's public lands in federal ownership? Yes or no? This one question can change the narrative, and here's how. It allows us to engage the public with why public lands matter to them, from grazing fees to access for fishing and hunting and everything in between. It inspires folks who have never registered to vote to understand that they have the power to save something they value if they vote. And it can mobilize turnout by making public lands a campaign issue. It also helps us cut through the noise. It puts candidates on record. No dodging, no spin, no decades-long false narrative. It gives political cover to those who want to protect public lands and allows them to campaign on the issue. And it unites Americans across party lines. Public lands aren't a partisan issue unless you're trying to sell them off. Asking this question is democracy in action. Everyday people standing up for what belongs to all of us. This message resonates from families vacationing in national parks to local chambers of commerce and gateway communities to climate advocates. Public lands are as American as apple pie. So how do we shift the narrative? We empower people locally and nationally to take action, to tell their stories, and to connect with others through their own networks. And we already collectively have what we need to do this. Every organization working tirelessly to keep public lands in public hands has talking points, social media graphics and templates, email scripts and sample letters to the editor and op-eds, and a membership that already understands what is at stake and can be mobilized to help change the narrative. Keeping public lands in public hands is common ground. Educating the voting public about who wants to keep public lands public and who doesn't supports all of our missions. It also amplifies the message on everything from addressing the attacks on the roadless rule to BLM's loss of authority to defer oil and gas lease nominations. Every day there's a new thing attacking, a new law, a new executive order coming out, going after our public lands. All of that information needs to continue to be addressed. But an overarching, do you support public lands and federal ownership? Yes or no? Really focuses the American public on what is at stake. And the stakes are high. This isn't just about saving land. It's about defending democracy. Public lands represent core American values of freedom, access, stewardship, and history. And if we lose them, we don't lose just trails and forests and rivers. We lose a part of who we are. So I want to thank all of you for showing up and listening to the presentation, and I can now take questions and answers and hopefully have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carey. I don't see any questions posted in our chat, but there are only